The pencil. A foggy morning on Route 12. Ethan Cole pulled his truck to the shoulder where a silver Bentley had wrapped itself around an oak tree. Glass everywhere, blood on the steering wheel. A woman slumped against the airbag, barely breathing. He pulled her out, drove her to the county hospital, and left before anyone could ask his name. The only thing he left behind was an old wooden pencil that had fallen from his pocket onto the passenger seat. 2 years passed. He never expected her to find him. 2 years had passed since that foggy morning on Route 12, and Ethan Cole had not thought about the woman in the Bentley for a long time. His life in Millbrook moved in small, predictable circles. Wake at 5:30. Make breakfast for Lucas. Drop him at school. Open the garage by 7. Fix whatever rolled through the door. Pick up his son. Cook dinner. Help with homework. Sleep. Repeat. It was not exciting, but it was honest work. And honest work was all Ethan had ever known. The garage was a modest place on the edge of town. A concrete building with 3 bays and a hand-painted sign that read Cole's Auto Repair. Ethan had inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of Cole men had spent their lives under the hoods of other people's cars. Ethan saw no reason to break that tradition. The pay was enough to keep the lights on and food on the table. Beyond that, he did not ask for much. Lucas was 8 years old now, a quiet boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. He did not talk much at school, and his teachers often sent notes home expressing concern about his social development. But Ethan knew his son better than any teacher could. Lucas was not withdrawn. He simply lived in a world of his own making, a world of colors and shapes and images that only he could see. The boy spent every spare moment drawing, filling notebook after notebook with sketches of birds and trees and faces he invented from nothing. Some days Lucas would stop drawing and rest his head on the table, complaining that he felt tired. Other times, Ethan noticed his son breathing a little harder than normal after climbing the stairs or walking back from school. He always told Lucas to drink more water and get more sleep. Boys his age were supposed to be energetic, but Lucas had always been the quiet type, preferring to sit and draw rather than run around with other kids. Ethan never thought much of it. He assumed it was just how his son was built. Sarah had been the one who first noticed their son's gift. She had been a painter herself, a talented one, before the cancer took her 3 years ago. Ethan still remembered the way she would sit with Lucas at the kitchen table, guiding his small hand across the paper, teaching him to see the world the way artists do. When she died, Lucas stopped drawing for almost 6 months. Then one morning, without explanation, he picked up a pencil and started again. He had not stopped since. The pencil Lucas used most often was an old wooden one, worn down to half its original length, with teeth marks near the eraser from years of nervous chewing. It had belonged to Sarah. Ethan had a dozen just like it in a coffee can on his workbench. But that particular pencil was the one Lucas carried everywhere. It was his connection to his mother, a small piece of her that he could hold in his hand. Ethan understood. He had his own relics. A wedding ring he still wore. A bottle of her perfume he never opened. Grief took different shapes for different people. Some evenings after dinner, Lucas would sit on the garage floor while Ethan worked on whatever car needed finishing. The boy would sketch in silence, occasionally looking up to study the way light fell across metal and chrome. Ethan would watch him from the corner of his eye, marveling at how much he looked like Sarah in those moments. The same concentration, the same slight frown when something was not quite right. Sometimes it hurt to look at him. Most times it was the only thing that kept Ethan going. Money was always tight. The garage brought in enough for necessities, but there was rarely anything left over for extras. Lucas never complained. He wore hand-me-down clothes and used the same backpack 3 years in a row and never once asked why other kids had things he did not. Ethan tried to make up for it in other ways. Weekend fishing trips to the lake. Movie nights with microwave popcorn. Long drives through the countryside with the windows down and the radio playing songs they both knew by heart. It was not much, but it was theirs. The people of Millbrook knew Ethan as a reliable man, the kind who showed up when he said he would and never overcharged for his work. They did not know much about his past, and he preferred it that way. He had moved to town with Sarah 10 years ago, looking for a quiet place to raise a family. They found it here, among the cornfields and church steeples and neighbors who waved from their porches but did not pry. After Sarah died, the town had wrapped around Ethan and Lucas like a protective blanket. Casseroles appeared on their doorstep. invitations to Sunday dinners, offers to watch Lucas when Ethan had to work late. He accepted the kindness but kept everyone at arm's length. It was easier that way. Sometimes, late at night, Ethan would sit on the porch and think about the woman he had pulled from that wrecked Bentley. He wondered if she had survived. He wondered if she ever thought about the stranger who had carried her to his truck and driven 20 miles to the nearest hospital. Probably not. People like her lived in a different world, a world of private jets and penthouse apartments and problems that money could solve. She had probably forgotten the whole thing by now. Ethan hoped she had. He did not save her expecting anything in return. He saved her because it was the right thing to do. That was enough. Victoria Ashford had not forgotten. She could not forget, no matter how hard she tried. The accident had left her with a shattered collarbone, for broken ribs, and a punctured lung. The doctors told her she was lucky to be alive. If not for the man who found her on Route 12, she would have bled out in that car before anyone else came along. But when Victoria asked who he was, no one had an answer. He had carried her into the emergency room, told the nurses she needed help immediately, and disappeared before anyone thought to get his name. For 6 months after her recovery, Victoria tried to push the mystery from her mind. She had a company to run, an empire built on art galleries and auction houses and private collections worth more than most countries' GDP. There were board meetings to attend, acquisitions to approve, donors to charm. She did not have time to obsess over a stranger who wanted nothing from her. But the obsession grew anyway, like a vine wrapping around her thoughts until she could not shake it loose. The old wooden pencil was her only clue. When the stranger had lifted her from his truck and carried her into the emergency room, it must have slipped from his shirt pocket and fallen into the folds of her coat. One of the nurses found it there later and assumed it was hers. Victoria kept it on her desk in her Manhattan office, studying it during long conference calls, turning it over in her fingers like a rosary. The pencil was worn and old, the kind you could buy at any hardware store for 50 cents. There was nothing special about it. And yet someone had carried it in his pocket like it mattered. Someone had saved her life and walked away without a word. Victoria had hired 3 different private investigators before one of them finally found a lead. Traffic cameras on Route 12 had captured a partial plate number from the truck that brought her to the hospital. From there, it was a matter of patience, cross-referencing vehicle registrations, interviewing gas station attendants, following a trail of breadcrumbs that led eventually to a small town called Millbrook and a mechanic named Ethan Cole. The investigator had compiled a file on him. 34 years old, widower, 1 son, owner of a struggling auto repair shop. No criminal record, no debt beyond a modest mortgage, no social media presence, no connections to anyone Victoria knew. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary man living an ordinary life. And yet he had done something extraordinary. He had saved a stranger and asked for nothing. In Victoria's world, people always asked for something. She flew to Millbrook on a Tuesday, renting a car at the regional airport and driving herself for the first time in years. The town was exactly what she expected. One main street, a diner, a hardware store, a church with a white steeple. Everything moved slowly here, as if time itself had decided to take a break. Victoria parked across the street from Cole's auto repair and watched from behind tinted windows as a man in a grease-stained shirt worked on an old pickup truck. Ethan Cole, her savior. He looked tired, the kind of tired that went deeper than physical exhaustion. But there was something solid about him, something steady. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was. A boy ran out from the back of the garage, clutching a piece of paper. Lucas. Victoria had read about him in the investigator's file. 8 years old. Lost his mother to cancer. Showed unusual artistic talent. The boy handed the paper to his father, and Ethan stopped what he was doing to look at it. His face changed then, softening in a way Victoria had never seen in any of the powerful men she dealt with daily. He crouched down to be at eye level with his son, pointing at something on the page, nodding in approval. The boy beamed. Victoria sat in that rental car for 2 hours, watching their simple interactions, and felt something shift inside her chest. She had spent her entire adult life surrounded by people who wanted her money, her influence, her connections. Every relationship was transactional. Every kindness came with strings attached. But this man had carried a bleeding stranger to his truck, driven her to a hospital, and walked away. No reward, no recognition, not even a name. Why? What kind of person did that? She needed to understand. She could not approach him as Victoria Ashford. The moment he searched her name, he would see the magazine covers, the Forbes profiles, the endless speculation about her net worth. He would treat her differently, the way everyone treated her once they knew. The sincerity would vanish, replaced by the careful calculation she had learned to recognize in people's eyes. If she wanted to understand Ethan Cole, she would have to meet him as an equal. Someone ordinary. Someone with no power over his life. The idea came to her that night, sitting in a motel room that cost less than her usual breakfast. She would create a character, a woman passing through town, car trouble, needs a mechanic. Simple. Believable. It was deceptive. Victoria knew that. But she told herself the deception was temporary. She would get her answers, satisfy her curiosity, and leave. No harm done. She did not expect anything more than that. Kate Miller arrived at Cole's Auto Repair on a Thursday morning, driving a 10-year-old Honda with a deliberately loosened alternator belt. She wore jeans and a plain cotton blouse. No makeup, no jewelry except for a simple watch. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail. She looked like exactly what she was pretending to be, a woman on a tight budget, traveling alone, hoping the repair would not cost too much. Ethan walked out of the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. And for a moment, Victoria forgot how to breathe. She had watched him from a distance, but up close he was different. His eyes were kind but guarded, the eyes of someone who had learned not to expect much from the world. A scar ran along his left forearm, old and faded. His hands were rough with calluses. He looked at her without recognition, without suspicion, and asked what seemed to be the problem with her car. Victoria heard herself explain the symptoms she had rehearsed. Strange noise under the hood. Loss of power on hills. She had practiced the words so many times they sounded natural now. Ethan nodded and popped the hood, leaning in to examine the engine with the casual expertise of a man who had done this 10,000 times before. She watched his face as he worked, looking for some sign of the person who had saved her life. But he was just a mechanic now, focused on the task in front of him, treating her like any other customer. The diagnosis took less than 5 minutes. Alternator belt was loose. Easy fix. $20 for the part, $30 for labor. He could have it done by noon if she wanted to wait. Victoria said she would wait. She walked across the street to the diner, ordered coffee she did not drink, and sat by the window where she could see the garage. Her hands were trembling. She hid them under the table and tried to calm her racing thoughts. This was insane. She was one of the wealthiest women in America, sitting in a small-town diner, pretending to be someone named Kate Miller who could not afford a new car. If anyone from her board of directors could see her now, they would think she had lost her mind. Maybe she had, but she could not turn back. The question that had haunted her for 2 years was finally within reach of an answer. Why had he saved her? Why had he walked away? She had to know. Lucas was the first to break through her disguise, though not in the way she expected. He wandered into the diner during his lunch break from school, ordered a grilled cheese sandwich, and sat at the counter with a sketchbook open in front of him. Victoria watched him draw, fascinated by the intensity of his concentration. The boy was talented, genuinely talented. His lines were confident, his proportions accurate. He was sketching the view through the window, capturing the main street with a maturity that seemed impossible for an 8-year-old. Without thinking, Victoria approached him. She introduced herself as Kate, mentioned that she was waiting for her car to be fixed, and asked if she could see what he was drawing. Lucas looked at her with cautious eyes, clearly unused to strangers taking an interest. But something in her expression must have reassured him, because he turned the sketchbook toward her and waited for her reaction. Victoria told him the truth then, or at least a version of it. She said she worked in the art world, that she had seen a lot of drawings in her life, and that his was remarkable. The boy's face lit up with a shy pride he was clearly trying to suppress. He told her about his mother, how she had been a painter, how she had taught him everything before she got sick. He showed her the pencil he used, the worn wooden one that had been hers. Victoria recognized it instantly. The same type of pencil that sat on her desk in Manhattan. The one that had fallen from the stranger's pocket. This boy had another one just like it. When Ethan came to the diner to tell her the car was ready, he found Kate and Lucas deep in conversation about shading techniques. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them, his expression unreadable. Then he cleared his throat and said the total came to $47. Victoria paid in cash, leaving a $10 tip that Ethan tried to refuse. She insisted. He accepted with visible discomfort. As she drove away from Millbrook that afternoon, Victoria knew she would be back. The conversation with Lucas had awakened something in her she thought she had buried long ago, back when she chose ambition over everything else. And Ethan, standing in that doorway, watching a stranger talk to his son about art, there had been something in his eyes. Not suspicion, not hostility, something softer, something curious. She had not found her answer yet, but she had found a reason to keep looking. She returned the following week, this time with a story about passing through again on her way to visit a friend. The week after that, she invented car trouble that brought her back to the garage. By the third visit, she did not need an excuse anymore. Ethan expected her. Lucas asked about her job in the art world. And Kate Miller, who did not exist, began to feel more real than Victoria Ashford ever had. Spring turned to summer, and Kate Miller became a regular presence in the lives of Ethan and Lucas Cole. She visited Millbrook every weekend, sometimes staying at the same cheap motel, sometimes driving back to the city late at night. She told Ethan she worked as a consultant for small galleries, helping them organize exhibitions and evaluate new artists. It was close enough to the truth that she could speak about it convincingly, and far enough from her real life that no one would think to verify it. The lie grew easier each time she told it. Lucas attached himself to her with a speed that surprised everyone, including Kate herself. He had been a cautious child since his mother's death, slow to trust, quick to retreat into his drawings when the world became too much. But something about Kate broke through his defenses. Maybe it was her genuine interest in his art, the way she studied each sketch as if it mattered. Maybe it was the way she talked to him like an equal, never condescending, never dismissing his ideas as childish. Or maybe he simply sensed that she understood loss in a way most adults did not. She began bringing him art supplies from the city, professional-grade pencils, sketchbooks with thick textured paper, a set of watercolors in a wooden case that made his eyes go wide with wonder. Ethan protested at first, uncomfortable with the expense, but Kate insisted the gifts were nothing special. She said she got them at a discount through her work. Another lie added to the growing pile. The supplies actually cost more than Ethan earned in a week, but watching Lucas use them made every dollar feel worthwhile. Their Saturday routine became something Kate looked forward to all week. She would arrive at the garage in the morning, bringing coffee for Ethan and hot chocolate for Lucas. While Ethan worked on whatever car needed attention, Kate and Lucas would sit on overturned crates in the corner, talking about art and color and the way light changed throughout the day. She taught him techniques she had learned from artists whose work hung in museums. He taught her how to see the world through the eyes of a child who had already known too much sadness. Ethan watched these interactions with a mixture of gratitude and unease. He could see how much Lucas had changed since Kate entered their lives. The boy smiled more. He talked more. He showed his drawings to people other than his father, something he had not done since Sarah died. These were all good things, and Ethan was thankful for them. But there was something about Kate that did not quite add up. Small inconsistencies that nagged at the back of his mind. The way she sometimes reached for a phone that was not there. The designer watch she wore that seemed out of place with her thrift store clothes. The way she occasionally slipped into vocabulary that belonged in boardrooms, not small-town diners. One evening in late June, after Lucas had gone to bed, Ethan and Kate sat on the porch of his small house, drinking beer and watching fireflies blink in the darkness. He asked her about her life before Millbrook, and she gave him the same vague answers she always did. Grew up on the East Coast. Studied art history in college. Worked various jobs before finding her niche in gallery consulting. Nothing specific. Nothing he could verify. She deflected every personal question with another question about him, about Lucas, about the garage. Ethan noticed, but he did not push. Everyone had things they preferred not to talk about. He understood that better than most. What he could not ignore was the way his heart beat faster when she laughed. The way he found himself thinking about her during the week, wondering what she was doing, counting the days until Saturday. He had not felt this way since Sarah, and the feeling frightened him. It felt like a betrayal, even though Sarah had been gone for 3 years. It felt like a risk he could not afford to take, not with Lucas finally starting to heal. But Kate was there, and she was kind. And she looked at him in a way that made him feel seen for the first time in longer than he could remember. Kate felt it too. though she tried to convince herself otherwise. She had come to Millbrook looking for answers, not attachment. She wanted to understand why Ethan had saved her and walked away. Nothing more. But somewhere between the Saturday mornings and the porch conversations and the way Lucas called her name when she arrived, understanding had transformed into something deeper. She was falling in love with a man who did not even know her real name. The irony was not lost on her. She had built her entire career on authenticity, on separating genuine art from clever forgeries. And here she was, the biggest forgery of all. The phone call came on a Sunday afternoon in July, while Kate was helping Lucas organize his growing collection of artwork. They had spread his drawings across the living room floor, sorting them by date and subject, when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach drop. It was her assistant in New York, calling from a number Kate had specifically told her never to use except in emergencies. She excused herself and stepped onto the back porch, closing the door behind her. The emergency was a hostile takeover attempt. A rival collector had been quietly buying shares in Victoria's company for months, and he was now making a move to seize control of her board of directors. Her legal team needed her back in Manhattan immediately. There were documents to sign, meetings to attend, decisions that only she could make. The assistant's voice was strained with barely concealed panic. Victoria Ashford's empire was under attack, and Victoria Ashford was nowhere to be found. Kate stood on the porch for a long moment after the call ended, staring at the cornfields that stretched to the horizon. In Manhattan, people were scrambling to reach her, wondering where she had gone, why she had been so distracted lately. In Millbrook, a little boy was waiting for her to come back inside and help him decide which drawings to frame. Two worlds, completely incompatible, and she had been foolish enough to think she could exist in both. She did not hear the door open behind her. She did not know Ethan was there until he spoke her name. Not Kate. Victoria. He had heard enough of the phone call to understand that Kate Miller did not exist. He had heard the assistant say MS. Ashford, through the thin screen door. He had heard Victoria promise to fly back to New York on the first available flight. The woman he had been falling for was not a gallery consultant struggling to make ends meet. She was Victoria Ashford. *the Victoria Ashford, whose name appeared in newspapers and whose face graced the covers of magazines he had never read. The silence between them stretched like a wire about to snap. Victoria turned to face him, and for the first time since she had arrived in Millbrook, she had no idea what to say. The lies she had told over the past months rose up in her throat, choking her. She wanted to explain, to make him understand why she had deceived him. But every explanation sounded hollow before she could even speak it. She had lied because she was curious. She had lied because she wanted to understand him. She had lied because she was afraid that the truth would change everything. And now the truth was out, and everything was about to change anyway. Ethan's face was unreadable. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. The warmth that had been building between them over the past months had vanished, replaced by something cold and distant. He asked her one question, his voice flat and controlled. He asked her how long she had been lying to him. Victoria told him the truth. Since the beginning. Since the very first day she walked into his garage with a car she had sabotaged herself. Inside the house, Lucas called out, asking if everything was okay. His voice was bright and innocent, unaware that the world he had come to depend on was crumbling just beyond the door. Victoria looked toward the sound, and Ethan saw something in her eyes that he had not expected. Pain. Genuine, unguarded pain. Not the pain of being caught in a lie, but the pain of losing something she had come to love. He did not know what to do with that. He did not know what to do with any of this. Victoria returned to New York that night, leaving behind a note for Lucas that explained nothing and promised everything. She told him she had to go away for a while, but that she would be back. She told him to keep drawing, keep practicing, keep believing in the gift his mother had given him. She signed it Kate, because that was the only name he knew her by, and because Victoria Ashford felt like a stranger wearing her skin. 3 weeks passed without any word from Kate. Lucas asked about her every day, his questions growing more desperate as the silence stretched on. Ethan gave him the same answer each time. She had work to do in the city. She would come back when she could. He did not know if that was true. He did not know anything anymore. The woman he thought he knew had turned out to be someone else entirely, and he was still trying to figure out what that meant. The detective arrived on a Tuesday, driving a black sedan that looked out of place on Millbrook's dusty streets. His name was Raymond Cross, and he had been hired by Victoria's board of directors to investigate her recent behavior. They were concerned, he explained. She had been disappearing for weeks at a time, neglecting her responsibilities, making decisions that did not align with her usual patterns. They wanted to know if she was being blackmailed, manipulated, or otherwise compromised. Raymond had traced her movements to Millbrook, and specifically to Ethan Cole. Ethan invited the detective into his kitchen and listened as the man laid out everything he had discovered. Victoria Ashford was not just wealthy. She was one of the most powerful women in the American art world, with a net worth exceeding $2 billion. She owned galleries in New York, London, Paris, and Tokyo. She advised museums on acquisitions and authenticated masterpieces that sold for tens of millions. She had spent 2 years searching for the man who saved her life, hiring investigators, following leads, refusing to give up, even when everyone around her told her to let it go. Raymond placed a photograph on the kitchen table. It showed Victoria at a charity gala, wearing a gown that probably cost more than Ethan's house, surrounded by people whose faces he recognized from television. She looked nothing like Kate Miller. She looked like exactly what she was, a billionaire, a power broker, a woman from a world so far removed from his that they might as well have been different species. And yet she had chosen to spend her weekends in his garage, sitting on overturned crates, drinking coffee from chipped mugs, pretending to be ordinary. The detective asked if Ethan had any idea why she had targeted him. That was the word he used. Targeted. As if Ethan were a mark in some elaborate con, a victim waiting to be exploited. Ethan thought about the months he had spent with Kate, the conversations they had shared, the way she looked at Lucas with something that resembled maternal love. Had any of it been real? Or had he been living inside a performance, a role she had created for reasons he would never understand? Raymond left a business card and told Ethan to call if he remembered anything useful. After the detective's card disappeared down the road, Ethan sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the photograph. Lucas's drawings covered the refrigerator door, many of them featuring a woman with dark hair and a kind smile. Kate. Victoria. Whoever she was. His son had drawn her into their family, made her part of their story. And now Ethan had to explain that the story was a lie. That night, he told Lucas the truth. Not all of it, just enough for an 8-year-old to understand. Kate was not who she said she was. She had secrets she had not shared with them. She might not be coming back. Lucas listened without speaking, his face pale in the lamplight. When Ethan finished, the boy went to his room and closed the door. Through the wall, Ethan could hear him crying. He wanted to go in, to hold his son, to promise that everything would be okay. But he could not make that promise. He did not know if anything would ever be okay again. Victoria returned to Millbrook 2 weeks later, driving the same rental car she had used before, wearing the same simple clothes that had once made her feel invisible. She had spent the time in New York fighting off the takeover attempt, restructuring her board, reasserting control over an empire she had built from nothing. She had won, as she always won. But the victory felt hollow. Every meeting, every negotiation, every triumph reminded her of what she had lost. A mechanic and his son in a small town no one had heard of. A life that was simple and real and hers, until she had destroyed it with her own deception. Ethan was waiting for her at the garage. He had seen her car coming down the main street and had walked outside to meet her before she could reach the door. His face was set in hard lines, his jaw clenched tight. He looked at her the way he might look at a stranger who had wandered onto his property uninvited. No warmth, no welcome, just a cold, controlled anger that was worse than any shouting could have been. Victoria tried to explain. She told him about the accident, about the 2 years she had spent searching for him, about the obsession that had consumed her until she finally found his name. She told him she had come to Millbrook only to understand why he had saved her, why he had walked away without asking for anything. She told him she had never intended to stay, never intended to fall in love with his son, never intended to fall in love with him. The words tumbled out of her, raw and unpolished, stripped of the careful rhetoric she used in boardrooms and negotiations. She was not Victoria Ashford right now. She was just a woman who had made a terrible mistake and was begging for forgiveness. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he took a long breath and told her what he had decided. He said that he understood why she had lied. He said that he believed she had not meant to hurt them. But understanding and believing did not change what had happened. His son had trusted her. His son had loved her. And she had let Lucas build a relationship with someone who did not exist. That was not something Ethan could forgive. That was not something he was willing to explain to an 8-year-old boy who had already lost his mother and was now losing the closest thing he had found to replace her. Victoria asked if there was anything she could do, any way to make things right. Ethan shook his head. He said the only thing she could do was leave and not come back. He said that he and Lucas were going to move away from Millbrook, start over somewhere new, somewhere that did not have memories of her in every corner. He said that he wished her well, genuinely, but that he needed her to stay out of their lives. The words were not cruel. They were just final. She drove away from the garage for the last time as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. In her rearview mirror, she could see Ethan standing in the same spot, watching her go, making sure she was really leaving. She did not cry. She had trained herself long ago to suppress tears, to show no weakness, to keep moving forward no matter what. But something inside her broke that evening. Something she had not known was still intact. She had spent her whole life acquiring things: art, companies, properties, influence. And now she had finally found something she could not buy, could not negotiate, could not win. She had found it and lost it. And the loss felt like dying. Back in Millbrook, Ethan walked into the house and found Lucas sitting at the kitchen table, his sketchbook open in front of him. The boy was drawing a picture of 3 people standing together: a man, a woman, and a child. A family. Ethan sat down beside his son and put an arm around his thin shoulders. He told Lucas they were going to take a trip, see some new places, have an adventure. Lucas asked if Kate was coming with them. Ethan said no, she was not. The boy did not ask why. He just closed his sketchbook and went to his room to pack. Ethan spent the next 2 weeks preparing to leave Millbrook. He found a buyer for the garage, a young mechanic from the next town over who had been looking for a place of his own. The price was lower than the property was worth, but Ethan did not have time to negotiate. He needed to get Lucas away from this place, away from the memories, away from the ghost of a woman who had never really existed. The sale closed quickly, and Ethan packed their belongings into his truck with the efficiency of a man who had learned not to accumulate too much. They made it as far as a small town called Cedar Falls, 300 miles from Millbrook, before everything fell apart. They had been on the road for 2 weeks, staying in motels, eating at roadside diners, pretending they were on an adventure instead of running away from memories they could not escape. Ethan had found a garage that was hiring, and he planned to settle there, start over, build a new life in a place where no one knew their story. But life had other plans. Lucas collapsed on a Wednesday morning while they were eating breakfast at a diner that reminded them both of the one back in Millbrook. One moment he was drawing in his sketchbook the way he always did while waiting for his pancakes. The next moment he was on the floor, his face gray, his lips turning blue, his small body convulsing in a way that stopped Ethan's heart. The ambulance came within minutes, but those minutes felt like hours. Ethan held his son's hand and prayed to a God he was not sure he believed in anymore. The diagnosis came that evening, delivered by a cardiologist with tired eyes and a gentle voice. Lucas had a congenital heart defect, a condition he had been born with, but that had never been detected. The doctor explained that Lucas had probably experienced minor symptoms for years: fatigue, shortness of breath, occasional dizziness, symptoms that could easily be mistaken for normal childhood tiredness, especially in a boy who spent most of his time sitting quietly and drawing. The condition had been slowly worsening, and now it had reached a critical point. Lucas needed surgery. He needed it soon. Without it, he might not survive the month. Ethan listened to the doctor's explanation with a numbness that felt like drowning. He thought about all the times Lucas had complained of being tired, all the times he had seen his son breathing hard after climbing stairs. He had always assumed it was nothing. He had always told Lucas to rest, drink some water, and everything would be fine. How could he have been so blind? How could he have missed something so important in his own child? The cost of the surgery was $400,000. The hospital's financial counselor delivered this number with practiced sympathy, as if she had given this same speech 100 times before. She explained the options. Insurance would cover some of it, but Ethan's policy had a cap that would leave him responsible for at least $250,000. He could apply for assistance programs, but those took time, and time was something Lucas did not have. He could take out loans, but no bank would lend that much to a mechanic with no assets and no credit history worth mentioning. Ethan sat in the hospital hallway that night, staring at the fluorescent lights, trying to figure out how to save his son's life. The money from selling the garage would barely cover a tenth of what he needed. He had no family to call, no friends with that kind of money, no connections to anyone who could help. He was alone in a strange town with a dying child and no way to keep him alive. This was the nightmare he had always feared, the one that had haunted him since Sarah's death. Losing Lucas. Being left with nothing and no one. He had survived losing his wife. He did not think he could survive losing his son. The wooden pencil sat on Lucas's bedside table, next to a sketchbook full of drawings the boy had made during their trip. Ethan picked it up and turned it over in his hands, feeling the worn wood, the teeth marks near the eraser. Sarah's pencil. The last piece of her that Lucas carried everywhere. If Sarah were here, she would know what to do. She had always been the strong one, the one who faced problems head-on while Ethan stood paralyzed by fear. But Sarah was gone, and Ethan was alone, and his son was dying in a hospital bed 10 feet away. He did the only thing he could think of. He called every number in his phone, begging for help from people who barely remembered his name. He called old friends from high school who had moved on with their lives. He called distant relatives who had not spoken to him in years. He called the bank, the church, the local charities, anyone who might be able to offer something. The answers were always the same. Sympathy, regret, inability to help. By the end of the second day, Ethan had exhausted every option he could imagine. The surgery was scheduled for the following week, and he had no way to pay for it. Victoria found out about Lucas through Raymond Cross, the detective who had been hired to investigate her. She had kept the man on retainer after the initial investigation, asking him to provide occasional updates on Ethan and Lucas without their knowledge. She told herself it was just to make sure they were okay, that she was not interfering with their lives, just watching from a distance. But when Raymond called to tell her that Lucas was in a hospital in Cedar Falls with a life-threatening heart condition, Victoria knew that distance was no longer an option. She flew to Cedar Falls that same night, chartering a private jet and arriving at the hospital before dawn. She did not go inside. She sat in her car in the parking lot, watching the entrance, trying to decide what to do. Ethan had told her to stay away. He had made it clear that he wanted nothing from her, that her presence in their lives had caused enough damage. If she walked into that hospital, she would be violating his trust again. But if she stayed in the car, Lucas might die. And she could not let that happen. She could not let that boy die when she had the power to save him. The decision, in the end, was simple. She called the hospital's billing department and asked to speak with someone about Lucas Cole's account. She identified herself as a family friend and asked what the total cost of his care would be, including the surgery, the recovery, and any follow-up treatment. The number they gave her was staggering for most people, but for Victoria, it was nothing. Less than she spent on a single painting at auction. Less than the interest her investments earned in a week. She gave them her credit card information and paid the entire amount. Then she asked them not to tell the family who had made the payment. She said it was from an anonymous donor who wished to remain unknown. The hospital administrator tried to argue. They had policies about anonymous donations, procedures that needed to be followed. Victoria used the voice she reserved for board meetings and hostile negotiations, the voice that reminded people she was not someone to be challenged. The administrator stopped arguing. The payment went through. Lucas Cole's medical bills were covered in full, and no one would ever know that Victoria Ashford had been the one to pay them. She should have left then. She had done what she came to do. There was no reason to stay, no justification for inserting herself back into lives she had already disrupted. But she could not bring herself to drive away. She sat in the parking lot through the morning and into the afternoon, watching doctors and nurses come and go, imagining what was happening inside. Was Lucas awake? Was he scared? Was Ethan sitting beside him, holding his hand, telling him everything would be okay? Ethan found her there just before sunset. He had stepped outside for air, overwhelmed by the miracle that had just been delivered to him. A nurse had told him that his son's bills had been paid in full by an anonymous donor. $250,000 wiped away as if it were nothing. Ethan had demanded to know who, had insisted that there must be some mistake, but the hospital could not tell him anything. He had walked out to the parking lot in a daze, trying to understand how something like this could happen. And that was when he saw the black car with the tinted windows. and knew exactly who was inside. He walked to the driver's side door and stood there until Victoria rolled down the window. They looked at each other for a long moment without speaking. She expected anger. She expected him to tell her to leave, to accuse her of trying to buy forgiveness, to reject her help the way he had rejected her before. But Ethan did not say any of those things. He asked her if she wanted to come inside and see Lucas. His voice was tired and broken and grateful all at once. Victoria said yes. Lucas was awake when they entered his room, propped up against pillows, looking small and fragile in the hospital bed. He saw Victoria, and his face transformed, the fear and exhaustion giving way to something that looked like hope. He said her name. Not Victoria. Kate, the only name he had ever known her by. She went to his bedside and took his hand and told him he was going to be okay. The surgery was going to fix everything. He just had to be brave a little while longer. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching them together, and felt something shift inside his chest. He had spent weeks hating this woman, blaming her for the lies she had told, the pain she had caused. But here she was, sitting beside his son's hospital bed, having paid a fortune to save a life without asking for credit or recognition. This was not the action of someone who wanted to manipulate them. This was the action of someone who loved them, truly loved them, in a way that did not require anything in return. He did not know what to do with that. He did not know what to do with any of this. The surgery took 6 hours. Victoria and Ethan sat together in the waiting room, not touching, barely speaking, but present. When the surgeon finally emerged to tell them it had been successful, Victoria wept for the first time in years. Ethan put his hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture that meant more than any words could have expressed. They were not okay. They might never be okay. But in that moment, they were two people who had almost lost someone they loved, and that shared fear had dissolved the walls between them. Lucas recovered slowly over the following weeks. The hospital discharged him after 10 days, and Ethan rented a small apartment in Cedar Falls so they could stay close for the follow-up appointments. Victoria visited every few days, bringing art supplies and books and meals she had learned to cook from watching videos online. She was terrible at cooking, and Lucas teased her mercilessly about her burnt grilled cheese sandwiches and overcooked pasta. It was the first time Ethan had seen his son laugh since they left Millbrook. They talked during those visits, Victoria and Ethan, about everything they had avoided before. She told him about her childhood, about the parents who had valued achievement over affection, about the loneliness that had driven her to build an empire as a substitute for connection. She told him about the accident, about lying in that wrecked car believing she was going to die, about the stranger who had appeared out of nowhere and carried her to safety. She told him that finding him had become an obsession because he represented something she had stopped believing in, the possibility that kindness could exist without ulterior motive. Ethan told her about Sarah, not the sanitized version he gave to acquaintances, but the real story. How they had met at a county fair when they were both 17. How she had believed in his dreams, even when he stopped believing in them himself. How her death had hollowed him out, left him going through the motions of life without actually living. He told Victoria that he had been angry at her not just for the lies, but for making him feel things he thought he would never feel again. She had woken something in him that he had buried with his wife, and that had terrified him. They did not fall back into each other easily. Trust, once broken, does not rebuild overnight. There were difficult conversations and setbacks and moments when Ethan wondered if he was making a mistake. But Victoria kept showing up, not as the billionaire who could solve any problem with a checkbook, but as a woman who was learning to be present, learning to be honest, learning to love without trying to control the outcome. She stopped hiding behind the armor of wealth and power. She let them see her flaws, her insecurities, her fear of being unworthy of the family she so desperately wanted to be part of. Lucas was the bridge between them. The boy had a child's capacity for forgiveness, a willingness to accept people as they were rather than as they pretended to be. He started calling her Victoria instead of Kate, adjusting to her real name with the adaptability that children possess and adults lose. He asked her questions about the art world, about the galleries she owned, about the famous paintings she had seen. She answered honestly, no longer pretending to be ordinary. And he accepted her extraordinariness the same way he accepted his father's ordinariness. Both were simply facts about people he loved. A year later, they were living in a house on the outskirts of a town neither of them had heard of before. Not Millbrook. Not Cedar Falls. Not Manhattan. Somewhere new. Somewhere that belonged to all three of them equally. Victoria had stepped back from the daily operations of her company, delegating to executives she trusted, making time for a life she had never imagined wanting. Ethan had opened a new garage, smaller than the one in Millbrook, but his. Lucas was enrolled in an art program for gifted children, his talent finally receiving the nurturing it deserved. They were not married. They had discussed it, but both agreed that a piece of paper would not make them more of a family than they already were. What they had was built on something stronger than legal contracts. It was built on choices made every day, the choice to stay, the choice to forgive, the choice to love someone despite knowing all the ways they could hurt you. On Lucas's 9th birthday, Victoria gave him a gift wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was an old wooden pencil, worn down to half its length, with teeth marks near the eraser. The pencil she had kept on her desk for 2 years. The one that had fallen from his father's pocket on the night he saved her life. She told Lucas the story of how she found it, how it led her to his father, how it had changed everything. The boy held it next to his mother's pencil, the two of them nearly identical, and smiled. Ethan watched his son examine the pencils, and something settled in his chest that had been restless for a very long time. He had spent years believing that his family ended when Sarah died. But families were not defined by blood or marriage or the circumstances of their beginning. Families were defined by presence, by showing up, by choosing each other again and again, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. Victoria caught his eye across the room and smiled. A real smile, unguarded and full of a peace she had never known before. She was not pretending anymore. None of them were. And that, Ethan realized, was the only happy ending that mattered. Not a fairy tale. Just the truth. 3 broken people who had found a way to be whole together. The last drawing in Lucas's birthday sketchbook showed a family standing in front of a small house. A man, a woman, and a boy. Above them, in careful letters, he had written a single word. Home.